Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I am your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. And we're actually going to do part 2 of the Diane case, right?
Yep, Diane Newton King, part 2.
So let me just sum it up a little bit. All right, so Diane King was a go-getter news reporter. She was a news anchor.
Yep.
And she was getting up there in ranks in the news anchor world. And she had gotten a phone call from someone that kind of wanted her to be their mentor, which turns out that this supposed fan wannabe mentee starts stalking her, like crazy calls about you should have went to lunch with me, and then these magazine clipped letters kind of threatening her. This mind fuckery that happens with Diane for years. Am I right? Did this happen for years, Trace?
Well, it really kind of started 8 months prior to her murder.
All right. So for months, and it ends up ultimately that the husband's a little sus. So in my opinion, it was the husband setting his wife up to think that she had a stalker and making it so she told everybody in her world, you know, her parents, her friends, her coworkers, that she has this stalker. All the while, I believe, I'm sure we're going to find out because that's where we're going to go. We're going to part 2 where you're going to tell me about, you know, they ultimately arrest the husband, but now we're going to find out all the rest. So it can go topsy-turvy. But this anchor woman, very successful, husband quasi-matching her in success, but not completely. But they have a nice house out in the wilderness in the Mitten, right? Trace, they're up in a nice place?
Yeah, they're renting a home that's on like 500 acres. And again, what a place to rent, but very secluded, right, out in the country in Marshall.
Right. But part of their seclusion is because she believes she has a stalker. So she is very mindful of always making sure that someone in her world, her mother, her friends, her husband, know when she's coming and going to and from her home so she can be safe because she lives out in the wilderness. So everyone in her orbit, her little world, is wanting to make sure that she stays safe and stays tracked, so to speak, because of this supposed stalker. Turns out she ends up getting shot one night when she came home. Unfortunately, her 2 children were in the car with her. So this bastard didn't even care about that, but that's besides the point. So these kids sit in the car forever while the cops come. The mom is shot. Diane is shot dead twice outside of her car. The dogs go in a big circle around her home, only to ultimately come back to the home. They find the rifle and everything buried in the mud along this circular track around the house. So they're left with, it's got to be the husband. This whole damn time, it's got to be the husband. Right? Is that where we left off?
That's where we left off. He was finally arrested. And where we're going to pick up today is we are going to pick up on the murder trial of Diane Newton King.
Okay, so they're trying the husband for it.
Yep.
It can't be nobody else. The idiot didn't think about not going in a clear circular motion around his property for the dogs to follow.
Yeah, he thought he was committing a perfect crime.
I did forget to mention, for those that didn't listen, this guy was a professor that taught students at a university, and one of his assignments was always how to do the perfect crime, to teach them about law, correct?
Yep, that is correct.
All right, so he had all the makings of a perfect killer, but he obviously wasn't as good as he thought. So what happens now, Tracy?
Yeah, that's right. And as he used to tell his students, there is no perfect crime because there will always be evidence. I guess he forgot to remember that part of it. So let's get into it. This is Season 3, Episode 15, Diane Newton King, Part 2. Now, before Brad's trial, when the attorneys were hammering out what could and could not be presented, you see, Brad was having multiple affairs with women and with students of his as well. He was asking students to go out to lunch and dinner hanging out at frat parties, just like he used to do when he attended Western Michigan University as a student back in the day. He would tell the ladies that he was a single dad, that his wife had just up and left him with the kids. Brad's defense attorney, John Sims, and the prosecuting attorney, John Salih, during the opening statements, Salih mentioned lunch and dinner outings, and immediately Sims started to request a mistrial, as it was clear that Brad's extracurricular activities could not be presented at trial. Salih made it clear that he was not talking about Brad's, air quotes here, dating, but that these were just meetings. And I was happy to hear that the judge allowed it and did not go for the mistrial that the defense attorney was asking for. So let's dive into the trial. Salih called a former student of Brad's to the stand. Her name was Heather Ann Taylor. She was a criminal justice student who attended Brad's class in the fall of 1990. The class Brad taught was Sociology of Law Enforcement on Thursday nights from 6 to 8:30 p.m. She, like a handful of others, also saw Brad outside of class. Brad would stop by often to see her at work where she was a waitress. In January of 1991, Brad and Heather met for lunch. Brad would tell her that he was having problems at home, that he was unhappy being back here in Michigan, and he much preferred to be back in Colorado. He had even told Heather that his mother-in-law was a bitch. On February 7th, 1991, Heather and Brad were together again as he had asked her to meet up with him. And just to remind everyone that this is the date that Diane had taken the children to visit her family in Sterling Heights, and that's near Detroit. He talked to her about his old frat life when he was in college. She said that Brad seemed unhappy and that she was being a friend, and that she basically would just listen to him. However, later that night at approximately midnight, Heather had attended a frat house party. She said she also saw Brad there, but during the party, they didn't even interact with one another. It was on Sunday, February 10th, 1991, that Heather learned of Diane's death through word of mouth, and then she saw it for herself on the news. When Brad talked to Heather about Diane's death, he said, quote, "It doesn't matter because they can't prove a fucking thing." He also told her that his old frat brother was an attorney in Detroit and that that's what frat brothers are for, to help each other out. A couple of months later, which was April of 1991, final exams were over and so was the semester at Western. Heather was working at Champs as a waitress. She told the court that she was at the bar getting drinks for her customers, and after placing her order, she turned around and boom, there's Brad, standing right behind her. Can you say creep alert? They spoke briefly, and this is when he told her that he was going to be moving back to Colorado. Brad would continue to call her sometimes, a couple of times a week. He would leave messages for her on her answering machine. She had called him back a few times, but they never really spoke again. Heather said it was basically a game of phone tag, and that was pretty much the end of her testimony. Next on the stand was Barbara Alcuta. She was a counselor, a Native American, and a close friend of Diane's. She was giving her testimony. She spoke of visiting Diane at Oaklawn Hospital after she had given birth to her daughter on November 20th of 1990. She said that Diane was depressed and that Brad was home with their son and Diane's mother, Frida, and stepfather, Royale. Barbara confirmed that Diane had told her about the disturbing calls she was receiving at the station, as well as the letter found in the mailbox. The two women had met in June of 1990. Barbara and her husband, Nuri, and daughter had also just moved to Michigan. She was looking for other professional Native American women when she found Diane, who worked at WUHQ. Barbara had called the station and left a message along with her phone number for Diane. A couple of weeks later, Diane called her, and soon the two would meet at the station. They discussed where powwows were happening, and the two would attend them together, go shopping. They attended Christmas festivities together, and they would often visit with one another at Barbara's home as well as at the farm. They quickly became close friends. She testified it was in mid-January of 1991, the last time Barbara had visited Diane at her home. She stated that she was aware of the calls and the letter Diane had received, and that this caused great concern to Diane. Barbara also recalled that in November of 1990 that the Kings had been given a dog for added protection after receiving the letter. On February 9th, 1991, Barbara had called the King residence. She had talked to Brad and asked to speak to Diane. He told her that Diane had gone to Sterling Heights to visit her mother and sister, and that she would be home later in the evening. Barbara told Brad that she would like Diane and the kids to come to her home for dinner, and that she would or could pick them up when she returned home. Brad also complained to Barbara during that call that their son Marler was being sassy and not listening. Barbara ended the call and said that she would call back between 6 and 7 p.m. when Diane would be home. Barbara and her daughter had taken a walk around that time when her husband Nuri had found them. Nuri told Barbara that Brad had called. He told Nuri that Diane was hurt, and that call came in at approximately 7:10 p.m. Immediately, Barbara and her husband headed directly to the farm. When they arrived, they saw police everywhere inside and outside of the property. Upon entering the home, Barbara stated that she had seen the children in the living room. She described that Marler was sitting on the couch crying, and Catarese was in her car seat. She, too, was also crying. Brad was in the kitchen preparing a bottle for his infant daughter. When Barbara approached Brad in the kitchen, she asked him what had happened. He just said, quote, "Oh, Barb," nothing more, and continued on with what he was doing. Barbara continued to testify that she and Nuri, her husband, stayed at the King residence that day for almost 2 hours, and that was February 9th, the day that Diane had been shot. Barbara had stated that Brad had gone out to the Jeep Cherokee that Diane had driven home from her mother's. He reached in and pulled out a bag that Diane had packed to give Barbara and her husband, as they had offered to take the children home with them in order to help Brad. Later that night, Brad called Barbara. He said, quote, "Hello, Barb. Diane's dead." When she asked him if he had called Diane's mother, he said he had. Again, Barbara asked what happened, but Brad didn't provide any details. When she asked him if Diane's mother was coming, he simply said no. Barbara described Brad as being blunt. The next day, Sunday, February 10th, 1991, Brad came to visit Barbara and the kids in the afternoon. But Brad wasn't alone. He had his good old frat buddy with him, the attorney, Randy Wright. When she inquired about Diane, he again said nothing. Barbara called for Marler to come see his father. Marler came running down the stairs, hugged his dad, and sat on his lap for a few minutes. Then he hopped down and went back upstairs to play. Brad and Randy stayed for a couple of hours and ate dinner with the family. Brad had finally said that Diane had been shot, but didn't elaborate much more than that. Brad's children would end up staying with Barb and her husband for a few more days. Barb also testified that she had seen firearms at the King residence. She said that one time she was visiting Diane at the farm, Brad had walked into the home holding a gun. She said it caught her attention as it had a long, skinny barrel. Barb also testified that while at Diane's funeral, she had been speaking with Brad, and he had mentioned that he was going to have Diane cremated. And this was extremely upsetting to her and other Native Americans at the funeral, quote, "because that's not the Indian way. The Indian way was to be buried." After others had joined in on this conversation, Brad relented and said that he would not have her cremated. They had also spoke about the children and that Catarese was still not feeling well. She asked Brad what he wanted them to do as she was worried about the baby. With Brad's permission, Barbara had taken Catarese to the doctor to be seen. 5 days later, Frida, Diane's mother, had come for the children, and this was the end of her testimony. Next on the stand was Virginia Zapinski. She and Diane had grown up together. She stated that Diane had visited Virginia in Troy on February 8, 1991. Now, Troy is also close to Detroit and Sterling Heights. It's not too far away. This is the day before Diane was shot and killed. While Diane was visiting, she had received 2 calls, one at 7:25 p.m. and one at 7:28 p.m. Both calls were from Brad. Diane became sad and started to cry after she hung up. Diane had told Virginia that she should be very happy right now because she had just had a baby. She has 2 children and she is married. But she said she was very unhappy and that she just should walk right out of this marriage. Diane also told her that she and Brad weren't having sex very often and that Brad didn't seem to be paying attention to her and that she felt he just wasn't interested in her anymore. By the time Diane left, she was still upset, but for another reason. Previously, when Virginia had visited Diane at their home in Marshall just before the baby was born, Diane told Virginia that she thought Brad could possibly be having an affair because of her being pregnant, that maybe she didn't seem attracted to him, and that with Brad being at the university, he may have become interested in the young women students there. Virginia also went on to say that during this visit on February 8th, that Diane had told her she would like to not work anymore so she could stay home with her children. During this time, Brad was a part-time professor of criminology at Western Michigan University. Diane also told her of the calls she had been receiving at work. They discussed this several times. Initially, Diane explained it as being a nuisance, as this person kept asking her how to break into the news business. Then later, she thought that this person was interested in her. Diane also told Virginia about the letter she found in her mailbox. Virginia stated that Diane called her from work at Virginia's place of work. She was upset and asked Virginia if she would come and stay with her and said she was looking for people to come and stay with her on the days that Brad would be away from the home. Virginia stated that Diane had used her phone and called Brad. When the call ended, Diane was in a hurry to leave. She was upset when she walked out, and now this visit was on a Friday, the day before Diane's murder. Sunday morning, February 10th, Virginia received a call from Roy L. Newton, Diane's stepfather. He notified her of Diane's death. While at the funeral, Virginia had an opportunity to speak with Brad. She stated that his demeanor at times was sad, but mostly he was taking it well. After the funeral dinner, Brad took Marlar to visit Virginia, but while he was visiting, he had never even brought up Diane, and neither did she because she didn't feel she could talk to him about her. Virginia explained to the court that before Diane's death, Brad was always a quiet kind of person. He always stayed in the background, but after her death, he was much more talkative. He seemed to her to be able to turn his emotions on and off. She said he was more, air quotes here, showy. Prior to Diane's death, Brad had never visited Virginia before. And before the funeral, Virginia visited the King's home in Marshall. Brad yelled her name loudly while walking toward her with his arms open. He walked up and gave her a very strong hug. She said he was crying, but she didn't see any tears. He then released her from his embrace and walked out of the home. And this was the end of her testimony. Randy Wright also took the stand. Randy is the fraternity brother of Brad's from Western. He was the lawyer friend that Brad tethered himself to after Diane's murder. Brad and Randy had met in 1965. On February 9th, Randy received a call from Detective Schroeder. He said he needed to speak with him and that Brad had requested he come to the police department. So that's what he did. He drove to Marshall's police department in Calhoun County. Brad and Randy left the police department together around midnight and went to the Arbor Gate Motel and booked a room. He testified that Brad told him that he had been out for a walk and that he had been at the back of the property when Diane was shot. He also told Randy that he thought he heard a couple of gunshots, but that he had not paid any attention to it because of all the hunters in the area. Now, just a side note here. I find this very interesting, and here's why. When Brad was being interviewed by the police, he repeated over and over and over again that he had only heard one shot. Seems his story is changing a bit with what he told the police and what he told his attorney friend, Randy. After the two spent Saturday night at the hotel together, they woke up on Sunday, February 10th, and went to have breakfast at 7:30 in the morning at the local Big Boy before heading back to their hotel room. Once there, Randy placed a call to Detective Schroeder, but he wasn't available, so he left him a message. Schroeder returned the call around 10 a.m. Randy wanted to know if the investigation at the home was complete and if they could go back to the house. Brad needed to change his clothes and whatnot, and they were given the green light to go to the farm, and that's what they did. Later that Sunday afternoon, Brad gathered clothes and other odds and ends for the kids. Then both Randy and Brad headed over to the Alcuta's home where the children were staying. Barbara and her husband, Nuri, as Barbara stated in her testimony, hosted Brad and his friend for a few hours and fed dinner to the two men. When they left, they headed back to 16240 Division Drive. Both Randy and Brad decided they would drive around the property, and that was approximately 4:35 p.m. in the Jeep. The two of them went down and back on a road toward the back of the property. Randy said Brad brought up going to the back of the property to look at deer, as he said there were large herds back there. They ended up getting the Jeep stuck in the mud and had to walk back up to the house. Now, during their walk back, this is when Brad said that this is where he'd been walking when Diane was shot. Earlier that day, the two of them had also walked back into the property as well, but Randy said it was pretty muddy and he had his good shoes on and he didn't want to go back any further so he wouldn't ruin his shoes. The men were unable to get the Jeep unstuck, so Brad had asked one of his neighbors to pull it out for him. Randy went with Brad on Monday, February 11th, to make the funeral arrangements. They had breakfast with Brad's mom, then went to meet with the pastor at the church. Randy then headed back home around 1 p.m. to his home in Birmingham. Randy was with Brad from February 9th through to the 11th. Prior to this, Randy had not seen Brad, Diane, or the kids since just before Christmas in 1990. Randy stated that on Sunday night while at the King residence that he felt uncomfortable as he saw the search warrant on the kitchen table. He had read that the investigating officer had written that the trajectory of the bullet that struck Diane and that it was thought that the shooter was up in the barn, shooting toward the house. So he was concerned because he didn't know if the shooter was still in the area or if they would come back. While at the house later that afternoon on Sunday, a priest had stopped by the house to counsel Brad, and this marked the end of Randy's testimony.
Okay, so wait, let me stop you here. So Randy was his lawyer buddy from the frat, correct?
Right, Randy and Brad, when they attended Western, so they were friends. I don't know if he ever represented Brad in anything in the past, but he wanted his friend Randy, the attorney, to be with him.
But he's obviously not representing him if he's testifying.
Correct. But I think, in Brad's mind, because he stayed with him for a couple of days, he went along with Brad when he was visiting, Diane's friends. So not really sure what all that was about, like what was the motive and all that.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to have this guy defend him, but he had him testify instead?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if Brad was like, yeah, call my friend. He was with me. He knows, I didn't do it, probably.
He didn't give any testimony that helps him out any.
No, not at all.
Okay.
I didn't think so. So another woman was called to the stand, and her name was Cindy Acosta. Now, Cindy had met Diane in March of 1990 as she was Diane's substitute on WUHQ. Now, at this time, Cindy was also living in Marshall. She testified that the last time she had been out to the farm was in December of 1990, just a couple of months before Diane had been killed. Cindy also stated that Diane had stopped to see Cindy at her home on October 30th of 1990. They had a nice little visit, then Diane left to go home. It wasn't long before Diane came back, and now she had Marler with her, and she was crying inconsolably. Diane handed Cindy the letter from her mailbox. Cindy read it, then immediately called the Calhoun County Sheriff's Department, and Diane called Brad at Western, but she didn't connect with him and left a message. Cindy described that when the officer arrived, he put on gloves and examined the letter, then placed it in a plastic bag as evidence. He then took Diane to her home to secure the property and to check to see if there was an attempt of someone trying to gain entry into the home. Once the home and barn were looked over, the officer and Diane returned to Cindy's. She also testified that Brad had arrived at Cindy's home around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. When he got there, Cindy said he seemed, quote, very unemotional. They all then discussed what type of security measures they were going to put in place. Cindy found out that Diane died on February 12th, a Tuesday. When she called the King residence, Brad had answered. After giving her condolences, Cindy asked Brad what had happened. He said, quote, well, I guess she was shot. His tone was very emotionless. Cindy told Brad, quote, I know she loved you very much. And in a monotone voice, he said, yes, she did. Yeah, I know. This was the end of her testimony.
He's just playing the role.
Mm-hmm.
This guy's a piece of work.
Yeah, very cold. Next was Julie Cook. She was another student of Brad's from Western Michigan University. On December 11th, Brad picked Julie up at her home. He had come in and asked if he could make a call. She, of course, agreed. She testified that she heard him say to whomever he was talking to, quote, tell Diane that I will be working late tonight. Now, since the judge ruled that Brad's affairs could not be talked about, I'll leave it up to you of what you think he did that night. The next day, December 12th, 1990, Brad called Julie at her home. In fact, he had called her twice that day. That evening, Brad and Julie were together yet again. She had asked Brad if he was married. He said, well, technically yes, but that his wife had left him in mid-November. Now, I'll remind you that Diane was very pregnant in November and had given birth to their daughter on November 20th of 1990. From the stories he told her, she was under the impression that his son was living with him. Prior to December 12th and before Julie asked, he never mentioned anything about having a wife. February 7th, 1991, just 2 days prior to the murder of Diane and the day that Diane had left to visit her parents and sister in Sterling Heights, Julie and Brad were together again. They met up in the afternoon. Brad told her that the kids were going to their grandmother's. Julie had learned about the death of Diane from the news and even attended her funeral. She saw Brad there, but never spoke with him. She said that Brad wore a wedding ring on the first day of class in the fall of 1990, but that after that first day, she never saw him wear it again until the funeral. The two had spoken a few times after the funeral, but he never brought up Diane in their conversations. And this was the end of her testimony. Next up was Lori Olston. She owned a cleaning service, and when Brad and Diane lived in Battle Creek in the 3-floored apartment that I talked about in part 1, which was just prior to them moving to the farm out in Marshall. Lori testified that when she and her cleaning partner would be at the apartment in Battle Creek, that Brad would always be home, and this was in November of 1989. Lori and her teammate would clean the apartment weekly on Fridays after 10:30 a.m. When the Kings moved to Marshall in April of 1990, the two women had driven to the farm to determine if they would continue to clean for the Kings, but for them, the drive was too far, and so they did not continue to work for the Kings after they had moved. During her testimony, Lori stated that they never cleaned the basement in the Battle Creek apartment because Diane just wanted the stairs going down into the basement to be cleaned, and that was the extent of their work down there. Lori did state that there was either a bar of some sort or a counter, and on that counter, she did see guns. She also stated that she doesn't know the names or how to identify guns. All she knew was that they were long guns, just sitting there out in the open. Lori also stated that she cleaned the bathroom and kitchens while her teammate cleaned the dining room, bedrooms, and living room. This was the end of her testimony. Next up was Carol Mendez. She was the other cleaner that tag-teamed with Lori. Carol also confirmed that Diane wanted the stairs that go down into the basement of the apartment vacuumed, but they never did any other cleaning in the basement. She, like Lori, had also seen the guns sitting on top of the bar or counter in the basement. But, unlike Lori, Carol was a little more familiar with guns because her husband was a hunter. She identified the gun on the bar as a .22 rifle with a dark stock. When asked by the prosecuting attorney Salih if once she learned about the murder of Diane, if she ever reached out to detectives, she had said no. When asked why, she said, quote, "There were a couple of reasons. For one, I didn't want to get involved and that he just kind of made me nervous." The attorney said, "He meaning who?" And she said, "Mr. King." She also said the other reason was, "I've been through a murder trial with my own brother, and it just brings back horrible memories to me." Salih was challenging Carol's knowledge of firearms, as she had testified that she had bought her husband a few different guns, such as rifles and shotguns. Salih picked up one of the two weapons and evidence that had belonged to Brad, and these were on the floor behind the prosecution's table. Now remember, one of those weapons was pulled out of the creek in the back of the property, where they had also found a handful of .22 caliber casings. Salih wanted to know if she had seen these guns before. She mentioned that in the basement of the Battle Creek apartment, she didn't walk past the stairs that had to be cleaned, so she didn't get a very close look at the guns. She did say that they were both long guns and that one of them looked like it had a long, skinny barrel. So the weapon that Salih picked up was the gun pulled out of the bed of the creek. As he walked toward her, holding out the gun, she was looking at it, and when he asked her if she knew what type of weapon this was, she immediately said, "That's a .22 rifle," with resounding confidence. He asked her how she knew that, and she described the details of the gun with 100% certainty. When Salih showed her the other gun, which was one that you would kind of put together by connecting the stock and the barrel, she said she was not sure what that kind of gun was, and that was the end of her testimony. Next was a woman named Nancy Gwynn. In 1990 through 1991, Nancy was employed at Channel 41 Incorporated. She worked in accounting there. She had also worked for Channel 41 for 16 years. So between 1990 and 1991, she had gotten to know Diane well when she took the morning anchor position. Nancy also testified that she had met Brad. She would see him when we would pick up Diane after work. She also testified that after Diane had taken maternity leave at the end of November of 1990, that she returned back to work in January of 1991. Nancy acknowledged that she was aware of the calls Diane was receiving at the station, and, of course, she also knew about the letter Diane found in her mailbox. She also recalled on multiple occasions when Diane had the car and would drive home after work that Diane would ask her to call Brad so he would know when to expect Diane. When Diane was on maternity leave, the friends stayed in touch with one another. The last time the two spoke was either February 6th or 7th. Nancy also testified she knew Diane was going to take the kids to visit with Diane's mother in Sterling Heights. And this was the last time Nancy had talked to Diane.
I just want to say that I think that the only stroke of evil genius that this guy actually kind of had was the mindfuckery that he placed in her mind, that she started giving everyone in her orbit, her mom, her friends, like her coming and goings from her home. Like everybody that was close with her knew where she was and when she was going to be there. The diabolicalness of this mindfuckery was the simple fact of, now at his trial, everyone's going to testify that everyone knew when and where she was coming home, as if to give plausibility to the fact that her stalker would have known.
Yeah.
Like it's a little bit maniacally genius.
Yeah. He was setting up the perfect crime.
He was trying. He was definitely trying.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yep, okay. So in January of 1991, Diane had shared with Nancy that there was an attempted break-in at the farm. She said she had been visiting her mother again when Brad called her and told her about it. Diane said that she didn't know why Brad would call her and tell her that. Nancy said Diane thought Brad called her to scare her. Nancy said that Diane had also trusted her enough and would tell Nancy about her personal life as well, not just work matters. One day when the two were talking, Diane started to cry. When Nancy asked her what was wrong, Diane said, "I guess we're just going to have to get a divorce because I just can't go on this way anymore." She also said that they were going to a marriage counselor and that Brad wouldn't go. Diane talked to Nancy about this a couple of times. On either February 6th or 7th, Diane and Nancy were talking. Diane, again in tears, said that she was going up to visit her mom and that she had to get things settled. She also said that in June she had planned to quit working, but that she had been working on some tapes through the Kellogg Foundation. Now, the tapes that Diane was working on were to bring Native American and mainstream cultures together. She wanted to produce educational videos that would tell the real story, the true story of Native Americans. She would call it Thunder Spirit. She went on to say that Diane was going to try and do that and concentrate on her marriage and that hopefully things would work out for them. She also testified that now would be the time to concentrate more on Brad's career. Then after that, if they didn't work out, well, then they didn't. There were also some tax levies that Nancy was aware of because she did payroll at WUHQ. She said Diane was very upset about this. Nancy also said, quote, "I don't know what those were about." Now, I just want to remind everyone that Diane was the breadwinner here. Brad worked part-time at Western. He instructed class 1 day a week on Thursdays, so there's that. And let's not forget that he was having multiple affairs and dates, and a lot of them. And all that dating gets expensive. I wonder if he was taking out loans that she wasn't aware of. I mean, the dude's home all the time. Well, except when he was, quote, working late or out having lunch or dinner dates.
And this guy's just the everyday scrub.
Mm-hmm.
Really didn't get into that too much in the first half. That he was kind of just working part-time as a teacher. We didn't get into the fact that he was running around and being a sloppy slut.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to save that for part 2.
Yeah, because it makes it all the worse. And it makes, this guy's just a parasite. It's just a parasite. And I'm really annoyed by all the mind fuckery. Like this poor woman for the last, it looks like, year of her life. The last year of her life, she was slowly going insane from fear because of his mindfuckery.
Mm-hmm.
He invented a stalker and then kept doubling down on it to scare her. Like telling her that there was a break-in, which never happened. Sending her a letter with newspaper clippings like a serial killer. You know what I'm saying? It's the mindfuckery for me. I just can't.
Yeah, and also, we didn't talk about it in part 1, but regarding this break-in, Brad actually did break a window, but he wasn't too smart about it because he broke it from the inside. So that was something that also the police were like, if someone's breaking in, the glass would be on the inside of the house, not on the outside.
Yeah, this guy's a backwards genius for sure.
Yeah. Diane had told Nancy that regarding the break-in, Diane had told Nancy that she didn't think that anybody tried to break in, and she thought it was Brad trying to scare her because she said he does things like that. And that was the end of Nancy's testimony. The next one I listened to was from Diane's mother, Frida Newton. While on the stand, she recalled on February 7th, which was a Thursday, Diane had arrived at their home at approximately 2 p.m. Diane had planned to stay until Saturday, February 9th, 1991, because she said that she and Brad needed time together. The kids were to stay and that Brad would come for the kids on Sunday. I also want to add in that in the 2 days Diane was home, she had family time, making baskets out of bags that had great colors for themselves and their kids. But the entire time they were there, Catarese, their daughter, their 3-month-old, had a wicked cold. Diane was also nursing her daughter. Frida told Diane that she really needed to keep Catarese with her and that she would be happy to keep Marler. But when Diane was packing up the car to leave, Marlar was having quite the fit. So Diane loaded both of the children into her Jeep Cherokee. She told the kids, quote, "Well, I guess your daddy's going to be surprised to see you." Frida also stated that in either December of 1990 or January of 1991, that Diane wanted to quit her job to stay home with the kids. Brad said, "Are you sure we can afford you not to work?" Now, let's not forget that Brad was not pulling his weight here. One night a week, dude? Nah, you gotta move it. You gotta make more money. Diane and the kids left Sterling Heights at approximately 4:15 p.m. Diane usually called Brad when she was leaving, again, so that he would know when to expect her, but she couldn't make that call because her father, Royale, was on the phone. Diane had asked her mom to call Brad once the phone was free, and Frida testified that she did call Brad at 4:30 and told Brad that Diane was on her way. She did not say anything about the kids coming home, and that Brad also didn't ask about the kids. Now, perhaps this is because she didn't want to deal with any attitude from Brad, but that's just me hypothesizing. But from what I've seen, it seems like their relationship wasn't that stellar. Diane drove a Jeep Wagoneer. Marlar and Catarese were secured in the back seat in their respective child car seats. Frida stated that Marlar was in his car seat behind Diane, and Catarese was in her car seat to the right of Marlar. Frida said that it would take approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes for them to get home. Now, since Diane received the letter in the mailbox when she would arrive home and Brad was home, she would not even get out of the car. She would honk the horn, Brad would have to come out onto the porch, and then, and only then, would Diane get out of the car. When Brad was not home, Diane would have someone with her, and this was her routine. She would drive around the home and look to see if anything looked disturbed. Then, when she saw that everything looked good, she would then park and get out of the car. She would keep her friend with her until Brad came home from work. Now, Frida testified that she had been with Diane on a handful of occasions when Diane did this. Frida testified that she learned of her daughter's death on Saturday, February 9th at approximately 11 p.m. When she had not heard from Diane at 8 p.m., she called Brad to see if Diane had made it home. When Brad answered and when asked if Diane and the kids made it home, he said, quote, "There's been an accident." She immediately knew something was wrong. When she asked about the kids, Brad told her, quote, "They're fine." When she asked Brad where Diane was, he said, quote, "She's at the hospital." She said, "Why are you not with her?" And he said, "They won't let me." Frida testified that his voice, the tone of it didn't sound any different than he usually does. She went on to say that she woke her husband and said, "I need you to take me to Marshall. Something bad has happened to Diane. I just know it." Royale told her that before you get all worked up, let's call the hospital first. So they did. When Royal called Oaklawn Hospital, he was told that Diane was in the ER, but that they couldn't give any information and that they had to call the sheriff in Calhoun County. So that was the next call they made. Frida continued to state that when she called, she was told that there were 2 detectives that were on the case, but they were not available and that when they were, they would call back. Oh my God, how awful for this mother. I just couldn't even imagine what's going through her mind.
The horrible. But I was just thinking, and I didn't want to interrupt while you were talking again, like I normally do. But I was thinking, Diane actually was unknowingly brilliant as well, for the fact that not only did she tell everybody about her fears and how this supposed stalker was, mind fucking her and all that, turns out to be her husband, but also she was kind of foolproofing it to always stick to the safety measures that she had implemented by driving around her house, not getting out unless her husband, was there to see her get out, or to have a friend come home with her. So she knew that she was going home and he was going to be there. So she probably drove around the property like always and honked. So that gives everybody the imagery that she wouldn't have gotten out of the car if she didn't see him.
Yeah, exactly. And I think about this a lot, Christine. If she wouldn't get out of the car, right, she would honk, honk, honk when she knew Brad was there. So I, to me, I can only surmise that Brad must have somehow let her know that he was there, or somehow showed her that he was there.
The shot came from the upper window of the barn. He showed himself through the barn window. She pulled up and honked, and he said, "Hey, I'm up here, babe. I'll be right down." She got out of
Exactly.
the car, and he fucking shoots her. That's
Exactly.
the perfect scenario, because otherwise she would have, if it wasn't him, and then she wouldn't have gotten out of her car. She would have been in the car, and if it was actually a strange, deluded stalker, and he was going to murder her, he would have just shot her in the car, because she would have never gotten out.
Exactly.
And then it would have traumatized her children for life.
Exactly.
So I'm glad that this is not an actuality, and this was all in his delusions, that it was a stalker in the first place. And this maniacal bastard waved her out of the car so she can get out of the car, and he can shoot her.
Yeah. It's nuts.
But the simple fact that I was thinking that actually sets the scene for he had to have been there, because she would have never gotten out of the car. And everyone in her orbit, everyone in her life knows this of her, because he mind fucked her for months.
Yep.
And trained her to be this way.
Exactly.
So the exact thing that he ended up training her to do is the exact thing that'll hasten his downfall.
Yep.
Kind of love that.
So Frida and Royale waited an hour, but still they had not received a call, so they called again. And this is when they were connected to the detective interviewing Brad at the station. And this is when the detective handed the phone to Brad, and when he bluntly said, quote, "Diane's dead." And then he handed the phone back to the detective. Frida continued to say that the family headed to the farm in Marshall. When they went to the funeral, Brad was there, but not for long. When Diane's family returned to the farmhouse, Brad stayed in his bedroom. She talked about offering to take the children so he could focus on getting his life together and find a full-time job so that he could support his children. Now, over the course of this entire process, Diane's mother was raising the children, but there were a lot of complications and strifes along the way, as you can imagine. That was pretty much the end of her testimony. Now, let's talk about the deliberation. The jury had sent a note to Honorable Judge Sint that they were a hung jury, if you can believe that shit. They were looking for further instructions from the judge. The jury was then brought back into the courtroom where the judge gave them direction. He then sent them back to deliberate again. And I love that he sent their asses right back in there. Get back in there and look at it again. The jury commenced at 1:20 p.m., and at 1:55 p.m., they had reached a verdict, thank the gods. Judge Sint requested the jurors to be brought back to the courtroom. Prior to their return, officers were standing behind Brad. Judge Sint had given the usual instructions to the court, warning them that there are not to be any outbursts when the verdict is read. Quote, "We, the jury, find Bradford King, count 1, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. Count 2, guilty of carrying or possessing a firearm during the commission of a felony." The jury was thanked for their service and dismissed. While the floor person read the verdict, Brad immediately looked down. Brad's bond was revoked, and he was remanded to the custody of the sheriff until his sentencing date. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I love it.
Goodness, the jury probably went back, and they were probably, I would imagine, they probably had a little bit of a sticky situation on the premeditation. But you had to look into everything to realize that it had to be premeditated. Hindsight's 2020, and the way I'm hearing this story, so therefore the way we're telling this story, is it's duh, hello, yes, of course. He planted the whole stalker scenario, the whole idea of it, and mind fucked her for months about it, and then did the whole circle around, I don't even remember how large was that circle on the property? You said they had hundreds of acres up there, but how large was the actual circle that the dog followed the scent?
I don't know the exact square footage of how far he walked back there, but, as we remember from part 1, the dog, Travis, tracked from that upper level in the barn, out of the barn, down back into the property, along and across the creek. There's a creek back there where he shoved in his 22 rifle, and then out onto the road, and then from the road to the driveway. So it was just this big circle. Like, why would a quote unquote stalker walk around the property and then go back to the house?
Yeah, all in a matter of an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Dumbass. I did a crime, and then I'm going to go see if the cops are there yet. I'm just going to go check on the crime scene.
I don't think this dumb shit was expecting a tracking dog, because had there not been a tracking dog, he may have gotten away with it.
True story.
Yeah.
Dog is the one that gave them that perfect circle around the property. Like, hello, This is what happened. There's shell casings here, and then I follow this sucker's sweaty scent all the way around the property. And oh yeah, by the way, midway in that circle, we find the gun buried in a creek, and then circled all the way back to the house again for them to be once again at the crime scene. So that dog really did set the picture.
Yeah. He solved the crime.
That is the reason why he's in jail.
Yeah.
Sure.
Go Travis. Go Travis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Brad was sentenced to life of imprisonment on January 6th, 1993. That's 2 years, just shy of 2 years after Diane's murder. Now, on a side note, in the audience, of course, was Diane's family. They all cried and hugged when they heard the verdict. But then the camera panned a little bit to the right of the family, and in the row ahead of them was Lowell Coffeyau. I was like, holy crap, look at there. And he's the author that wrote the book Forever in 5 Days about Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Woods, the Alpine Manor murders, the story that we covered in season 1.
Oh my goodness, there's another link. See, I feel like we're going to start seeing a lot more links because we're doing all these crimes in the men.
Yeah, I was like, oh my gosh, look at him. He's there. Of course, he was taking notes. He was probably there every single day. And there were a lot more people that were called to the stand. We would have had like 5 parts if I went into all that.
Yeah.
But as you can surmise, Lowell wrote a book about this case. And the name of that book is called Eye of the Beholder, The Almost Perfect Murder of a News Anchorwoman, Diane Newton King. Now, Brad is spending the rest of his life at the Thumb Correctional Facility, inmate number 228745.
So people can be pen pals with him? What the hell?
Yeah, I don't know. Because I can do a search. You can do an inmate search, so that's how I get their inmate numbers. He's gonna know that number quite well because he's gonna have to say it for the rest of his life. And I hope you enjoy your life in prison, you sick son of a bitch. Yep.
Well, so. I'm glad he got caught. And I think it's very funny that this macho man thought he was all that in a bag of chips, thought he was a teacher of the perfect crime, and then tried to actually apply his knowledge so awfully.
Fail.
It's kind of funny. It's just funny. It's ironic on some levels, and it kind of tickles me, except for the fact that this poor woman had to die for this man to be in prison when he should have just did away with himself instead.
Yeah. Now, I also just want to kind of throw in, because I keep replaying this scene in my head. So after Brad had shot Diane from above in the barn, remember there was that second shot? So,
yeah, that was out of complete malice.
Yeah.
That he came down, saw her on the ground. She may or may not have been gurgling or anything of that nature. Unfortunately, when people die, it doesn't always happen immediately. And then for good measure, he just shot her again. So that was pure evil. That was complete intent on her being dead.
Yeah, and here's the clinker. So remember, he would have had to, squatted real low to the ground because of the trajectory. So she's laying flat. Well, she was laying down. She had fallen back. Her legs were kind of under her. And so either he crouched down or he laid down and delivered that second shot. But when he got up, he had to have seen the kids in the car. And he still left them there. And that vision I can't get out of my head. He saw those kids.
And when you were just saying that, I just thought to myself, I kind of almost even heard it. Like he mumbled something to her because he's such a cow's pig. The other thing is how old was Marla at this time?
Marla was 3 and Catarese was 3 months old.
The thing is that 3-year-old probably saw his father deliver that second shot.
Yep. When a gun is fired, it is loud. And, those children had to have heard it, not only the first shot, but the second shot, which was very close to the vehicle. And they were both in that car crying until he took them out of the car after the ambulance left. I mean, he couldn't have cared about those children at all. A, he killed their mother. And B, he could have given a shit that the kids were in the car crying. You know what I mean? Like, as a mom.
Yeah, that would never happen.
No. Get those kids out of the goddamn car.
Out of the car before anybody else got there.
Yeah, that would have been my first thing. Grab those kids.
Yeah, but he was still worried about the perfect crime, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, being the shocked husband, Yeah. And he really wasn't a good actor at all because the differing testimonies give him completely different personalities after everything happened.
Yeah.
None of them were of the grieving husband. None of the testimony, at least when I was listening, sounded as if he was upset that she was gone.
Yeah. No, he was glad. It was
Yeah.
a burden.
But that's what I'm saying. That's another place where he messed up in his perfect crime. Is he wasn't upset in the least, and he did not have the appropriate reactions at all, even if they were shocky. You know what I mean? Like, even if someone is in shock from losing someone, it's almost like they're detached a little bit. But he wasn't detached. He was actually very mindful of, oh, Barb, or, like the things that he was saying that you were saying in the testimonies, that it wasn't of a husband that lost their wife.
No, not in the least.
And the fact that they had people testifying that he didn't wear his wedding ring ever, you know what I'm saying? Like, all of that leads to the details definitely had to be incorporated in the premeditation.
Absolutely. He just wanted to be, a college boy again. Brad is 11 years her senior. So,
oh, goodness. So not only is he a deadbeat working 1 day a week, mooching off of this woman, but he's also 10 years older than her?
11.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I hate this guy even more now. What a loser.
Yeah. Because she was, I would say she was probably in her early 30s because she broke into the business real late in life. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, that's right. She went to college a few times, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So this guy's a bona fide loser. I can't even with this guy. I hate him even more now.
Yep. I know. He's worthless. I hope he has and now in prison he can have as many dates as he wants.
Yeah, good on you. Okay. Have fun.
Yep. That is the story of Diane Newton King. Thank you, everyone, for coming back for part 2. And we will see you all back on Wednesday for Round Robin. Have a great week, everyone. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.